Hey guys, what's going on? It is Ash here coming at you today, highlighting a winning tournament deck again, and it's going to be an aggressive giant deck in today's episode. Really excited to share this one with you guys because namely, it only actually has one legendary card, and as you saw on the screenshot there, Clyde recently finished third in one of Galadon's big 1,000 person tournaments. So huge shout out to Clyde. He's one of our best players in all of Elite Gaming, and certainly we're going to prove why in today's episode. As you saw on that screenshot there, unfortunately, he only lost one match the entire tournament, and that match just happened to be his very last of the entire tournament, so he went from first place to third after his last match, but hey, he's still walking away with a ton of cards, and today we're going to see how he did so well and how he played this deck, and I was able to chat with him for a bit, and he shared with me a bunch of tips for using this aggressive giant deck. And of course, he answered the question that many of you will probably ask, and he said if you don't have the princess card, go ahead and use minions in place of the princess, just regular minions, not minion horde. He actually just got the princess. Before he got the princess, he was using the same deck with minions, and he was having a lot of success, finishing high in tournaments. As you saw from his player profile there, he had a significant amount of cards. That's not including the chest that he has not opened yet. So, by the way, trying to get some footage of that chest opening. It should be a good one, so we'll see if he can get the recording equipment in time. It would be interesting to see what he gets out of that third place chest in that 1,000-man tournament. So as we watch the first match here, you can see he's going against a Sparky Royal Giant Ice Wizard deck. It's a very tough deck. It's a very competent, and you certainly see decks like this all the time in the high-end leaderboards in these tournaments. So you'll see that he uses a number of methods to combat Sparky with this deck. Obviously, using a giant can really, a giant in tournament play can withstand 2 blows from Sparky, and you can see here that he uses the giant very, very nicely along with that poison spell to A, slow the rate of fire on the Sparky, and B, obviously soak up all that damage using the giant's incredibly high hit points. So that's one way to counter Sparky using this deck. Another way, the preferred way, is just going ahead and using skeletons. Having skeletons in a deck like this is absolutely great because what it can do is against these Sparky decks, you can use the skeletons as he did just there to go ahead and allow Sparky to fire. He wastes his shot, and then you can put down the barbarians, the mini P.E.K.K.A., whatever you want to take out that Sparky before he fires again. So skeletons are really useful. Also not in this deck, but worth mentioning, the best weapons to combat to counter a Sparky in the game are really the guards and the Dark Prince, because they have that shot absorbing a power there that it causes them to basically take an entire hit off Sparky, and all they lose is their shield there. So that's really nice. You can see Clyde actually finish that match really strongly with a 3 crown there. Let's go ahead and move on to the next match that he shared here. And this time we're going to be going against a Inferno Tower deck, which is really useful because obviously the Inferno Tower can really shut down some of these big giant pushes. So this will be a good replay to watch to go ahead and see how Clyde handles the Inferno Tower. And while we do that, I do want to start getting into these strategy keys for this deck. And number one, really you have to protect your Elixir Collector, specifically against minor decks. So against a minor deck, obviously this really goes with any deck, but especially with this deck, since that's the deck we're focusing on today, you really need to protect your Elixir Collector against these minor decks. So you have 2 weapons to go ahead and do that. Your first weapon is the mini P.E.K.K.A. Your second option is going to be Barbarians. A distant third option is going to be your Giant, but either way you have to protect the Elixir Collector, especially against these minor decks. You need the Elixir advantage, and the minor trade for the Elixir Collector obviously is a bad one, so you can't allow them for the cost of 3 Elixir to take out your entire Elixir Collector. Again, that goes for any deck. You do not want minors to take out your Elixir Collector. You have to defend your Elixir Collector. That's really, really important. It's not a value trade to lose Elixir Collector to a minor in any circumstance. So that's really, that's one of the huge keys to this deck. Protect your Elixir Collector and know where to place it at all times. But possibly even more important than that, I asked Clyde what is the biggest mistake that people use when they pick up a deck like this, a giant deck like the one that you've been playing with a lot of success. And he said it's really simple. The biggest tip about this deck, he said, is don't be afraid to take damage on your towers. In fact, he'd rather maintain the elixir advantage in a match and take some damage on a tower versus being way down in elixir and having to defend constantly. That's why we're calling this deck an aggressive giant deck. Obviously, you can play more passive or defensive giant decks and choose your spots, but that's definitely not what Clyde does. You can see that Clyde, a very successful tournament player, so we should heed his advice. He says be aggressive. Don't be afraid to take a little bit of damage. How much is a little bit of damage? He said he would take about 500 to 700 damage if he has to in order not to defend and save his elixir for a huge push. He said that in a lot of his matches, he ends up losing a tower and then he can make it up in the last minute, or he can make it up by building up that elixir collector advantage later in the match and then coming on really strong. He gets a lot of 3-crown victories with this deck. It's a really strong deck once you learn how to use it. So let's go ahead and focus a little bit on more types of counters on this deck versus popular archetypes in the meta right now. So against Royal Giant decks is really where this deck shines, right? So even without a building card in the deck to distract the Royal Giant, the deck still does a very good job of handling him. Again, you have the Mini P.E.K.K.A. and the Barbarians, two of the strongest defensive cards in the game, and what Clyde does here whenever he goes up against one of these Royal Giant decks, whether it be a Royal Giant deck or a Royal Giant Sparky deck as you saw in the first replay, and by the way, we're going against a Miner Furnace deck right now, one of my favorite decks in the game right now, and again, Clyde's going to come out with a convincing victory, and we'll see how in just a second. But getting back to my point there about a Royal Giant, using Barbarians and using a Mini P.E.K.K.A., and that's all he uses. He doesn't mind taking the 500 damage from the Royal Giant while those Barbarians or the Mini P.E.K.K.A. are going after him, and instead what he does is he takes the advantage of them at being at full health after they kill the Royal Giant and turns it into a really big counter push. So that's really where he gets a lot of his big damage off those Royal Giant decks, by using those full health Barbarians that he used to defend the Royal Giant and turning them into a big offensive push after the Royal Giant is dead. So against this match here, again, we're going against a Miner deck. So what did we just talk about? Defending your Elixir Collector is paramount here, and you can see he takes a decent amount of damage on that left tower right off the bat. But this was a good defense here, the Mini P.E.K.K.A. versus the Miner. That is what you want to do. Granted, you have to play a little bit of a guessing game. A lot of attackers, even some skilled Miner attackers, they won't differentiate the points that they put their miners on these Elixir Collectors. A good Miner attacker will always kind of keep the opponent guessing where to place their counter for the Mini P.E.K.K.A. on their Elixir Collector. So, but what I would do is, what I always do on miners at least, when I'm trying to defend and try to keep my Elixir Collector alive, I always just guess the last place that they put their miner, and then I defend there, because subconsciously, sometimes people, you know, they're obviously rushing in the match, and they just choose the same spot for whatever reason against the Elixir Collector. So you do need to keep your opponent guessing if you are the Miner player. If you're not the Miner player, as you can see, Clyde, again, right there, guessed successfully and was able to counter that Miner after not even one hit, only one hit to the Barbarian. So that was very successful defense there. So let's kind of zone in and focus in on the rest of this match and see how Clyde comes from behind to pick up this victory. So obviously he does have the Elixir advantage right now. He has 2 collectors on the board. He has to be feeling pretty good about that. And here's one of his big pushes here with the Giant, the Mini P.E.K.K.A., and then the Princess. Obviously, you have the Giant, a huge hit point meat shield. Then you have the high DPS of the P.E.K.K.A. with every swing. It takes down tons of damage. And then you have the Princess essentially defending whatever the counter is going to be to the Mini P.E.K.K.A. and the Giant coming in behind. And you can see there, he did a decent amount of damage to that tower. In fact, he took it down with the last shot from the Princess there. So very good job there on Clyde's part. And actually, he's going to run out of time here. The opponent, I should say, is going to run out of time, not even going to have the opportunity to go ahead and even things out. So a nice come from behind 1-0 victory here. Clutch 1-0 victory, all thanks to that big push that he was able to go ahead and orchestrate, thanks to having those 2 Elixir Collectors and having that huge Elixir advantage on the board at that time. So let's go ahead and end with one more replay here. This time, it's going to be against another Giant Sparky deck. So it's very important to learn how to counter Sparky no matter what deck you're using, and it's going to kind of bring me to the third strategy key of this deck. The first being that you should know how to protect your Elixir Collector in this deck. The second being that you shouldn't be afraid to take some damage. In fact, it's an aggressive deck, so don't be afraid to take a little bit of defensive damage for an offensive push. And the third is you need to know, especially with this deck, how to adapt. Another reason that Clyde is usually down in Elixir is because he figures out what the opponent is running. Once he figures out what his patterns and trends are in dropping the troops, he alters his play to start countering it. An example is going against an Inferno Tower, right? So it counters this deck very well, but played right, this deck will still win against an Inferno Tower. Another example is air decks. The deck only has the Princess, but once you figure out what your opponent is going to drop, you can better anticipate and therefore counter their play. So, for example, let's just pretend that you're going against a Lava Hound deck, and for example, it's a Lava Hound and a Balloon, and all you have is Princess and Poison in this deck in terms of anything that can damage air units. Well, what you can do with this deck is, and what Clyde consistently does, is if he sees an air attack, he'll try to defend as best he can. He might use Poison, he might use his Princess, but meanwhile, he's really going to try hard to focus on the opposite lane and get a good opposite push going of his own, because he's confident that his pushes can do more damage than anything the defender can dole out at him. Again, you can see a very convincing 3-crown victory against the Sparky deck, and you can tell by the confetti that these are close to the end of the tournament matches, meaning these are other top 10, top 20, top 40, whatever finishers in the match, aka very good players. So I just want to thank Clyde for giving us all this advice and allowing us to share his great deck. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I want to thank you so much for making it to the end of this episode. If you did make it to the end, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to give you some love. And guys, thanks so much for watching, and as always, take care, guys.